guns are usable on Black Ops 2 on round 50? That's what we're going to answer today. Map unique wonder weapons won't be on this list, but we will have the ray gun and the ray gun mark II. And if you want to see a part 3 to this video series, let's get this video to 300 likes. And also subscribe so you don't miss it. Let's get right into the video. First of all, going over the M1911, this gun's going to do 20 damage. It is a starting pistol after all, and with the headshot multiplier, you're getting 3.5. Magazine size is going to be 8, and with 80 in reserve, not going to do much. When you pack punch it to the Mustang and Sally, this is where things get better, just like the previous game, Black Ops 1. It's going to do 1000 damage on a direct impact, but the explosive damage has a potential of 1200. With 6 in each pistol, because it's dual wield, with 50 in reserve, this gun easily is going to get you a few kills on the higher rounds. Something that's worth noting as well in Black Ops 2 is that we have double tap 2.0. So any bullet based weapon is essentially going to do double the damage because there's going to be 2 bullets for 1. It's not just the fire rate that increases, the overall damage of each weapon will be enhanced significantly. And all the weapon damages we go over will be double for all bullet based weapons. So all the weapons I go over in the damage profiles, you can essentially just double it, and that's the damage that it potentially can do. Moving on to the Python, this gun can potentially do 1000 damage with a 1.5 headshot multiplier, with 6 in the magazine and 84 in reserve. When pack punching it to the Cobra, it's going to do 1000 damage, yet again, but it's going to have a 3 headshot multiplier, doubling it from its previous. With 12 in the magazine and then 96 in reserve, this gun on the higher rounds with double tap 2.0 is going to be somewhat of an effective weapon. You're going to get a few kills, but ultimately comparing it to the other weapons in this game, it's not that great. It's a very good pistol, but it just lacks in other departments. Moving on to the 5.7 that you can get by itself or you can get dual wield. This gun has the potential to do 160 damage with a 3.5 headshot multiplier. The magazine size is going to be 20 with 120 in reserve. When you pack punch this to the Ultra, it's going to do 300 damage, and then you have a headshot multiplier of 3.5 once again, with 20 in the magazine and 200 in reserve. This gun will get kills, but it won't be as effective as the Python and the M1911. So in the pistol department, it's definitely not the strongest, and with the dual wield version, the only thing that really changes is that you're getting a little bit more ammo in reserve for the pack punch version with 295 with 20 in each pistol. But this essentially makes it a little bit more difficult to go for that headshot multiplier, so you could end up be doing less damage anyway. But they're both alright weapons, it's just not what I would recommend for the higher rounds. Moving on to the B23R, this gun's going to do 160 damage, and this gun actually has 2 versions in the mystery box. So you're going to have the standard version that has 15 in the magazine, and you're going to have the one with the extended clip that has 24. With the standard having 105 in its reserve, and with the extended clip version having 168. So if you're going to go for any version, you're going to try and get that one. I don't think it's on all maps, unfortunately, but realistically, it does just have more ammo. And when pack punching it, the damage is going to go to 200 with a 3.5 headshot multiplier, with 20 in the standard version and then 30 in the extended clip version. And then going to the reserve, you're having 180 in the standard and then 270 in the extended clip version once again. Realistically, with this gun, I don't really see much point in using it. The only time I would really consider using it, even somewhat long term, would be on transit because it's on the bus, and sometimes it's just convenient to grab. But I wouldn't go past that and pack a punch it. Moving on to the most overpowered pistol in this game, the Executioner. So this gun doesn't have a headshot multiplier, it has shells. So just like the shotguns, it depends how many pellets are going to hit, and that's how much more damage you could do to a zombie. So the Executioner here has 130 damage for each pellet that hits, with 8 being the total, and with 5 in the magazine and 75 in reserve. In the lower rounds, it's going to be a good gun, but it's only when you really pack a punch it that this thing becomes a monster. With 350 damage times 12 if you hit all your pellets, with double tap 2.0, this thing is easily going to kill on the higher rounds. With 5 in the magazine, and then you have 100 in reserve. Overall, it's just a beefy weapon. This is something I would take with myself on the higher rounds. Moving on to the Cap 45, this thing is going to have 150 damage maximum with 3.5 headshot multiplier, with 12 in the magazine and 96 in reserve. This thing is fully auto, so that's pretty cool. When you pack punch it, it's going to do that 200 damage, and then it has a 3.5 head multiplier still, with 15 in the magazine and 180 in reserve. This is another one of those guns that, even though I enjoy using it, it's just something I wouldn't take with myself on the higher rounds. I just don't really see much of a point. But it's definitely one of those weapons that if you get it out of the mystery box, it's good to use in the lower rounds just for some points. Moving on to our Remington new model Army, this gun is exclusive to Buried, and it pretty much has the exact same stats as the Python, with this gun having a maximum of 1000 damage with a 1.5 headshot multiplier, 6 in the magazine and 84 in reserve. And when you pack a punch it, it's going to have that 1000 headshot damage, but will have 3 headshot multiplier with 12 in the magazine and then 96 in reserve. The one benefit of having this over the Python is the fact that it reloads a little faster, so if you're going to go for one or the other, I would always choose this, and it looks cool as well. Then moving on to our last pistol is the Mauser that is only in Origins. So this gun's going to act very similar to the M1911 when it's Unpack-a-Punch with 20 damage, a 3.5 headshot multiplier, 8 in the magazine and an 80 in reserve. But when you pack-a-punch it to the Boomhilda, it actually becomes the strongest pistol. I know we said the Executioner was, but this gun is miles better than it. With 1000 damage, with a 12 headshot multiplier, a whopping 50 in the magazine and 100 in reserve, this gun just becomes overpowered. It has the knockback effect like the ray gun, and that means you can traverse Origins a little easier with the mud. Overall, aesthetically, it's a cool weapon, but it's actually really good on the higher rounds against zombies and boss zombies alike. Moving on to our SMGs of Black Ops 2, we have the MP5. Now this gun's going to do 100 maximum damage with a 4 headshot multiplier. With 30 in the magazine and 120 in reserve, it is the perfect wall weapon for getting points. When you pack-a-punch it to the MP115, it's going to gain 40 damage, so it can do 140 damage, with a 5 headshot multiplier, with 40 in the magazine and 200 in reserve. This is a gun that's better just not pack-punching and using for points. On the higher rounds, it's not going to do that much, but it is a wall weapon, so it has that going for it. Moving on to the Chicken, it has 100 maximum damage with a 4 headshot multiplier. This weapon is a 3-round burst weapon, and it has 40 in the magazine and 120 in reserve. And when you pack-a-punch it, that damage will go up to 160 with a 5 headshot multiplier. It turns into a 4-round burst weapon, but when you pack-a-punch it and you get an attachment on it, you can get select fire, which makes it full auto. With 40 in the magazine and 200 in reserve, this gun's alright. It's not the best gun. It's a box weapon, so you can't get this off the wall. The mobility is okay, but overall there's just better guns to use in terms of SMGs. Moving on to the AK-74U, this gun's going to do 120 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier. And this gun's one of the other guns that have attachments. You can get the standard version, which will have 20, and then you have the extended clip version, which will have 30 in it. And then for the reserve, you're going to have 160 in the standard and 180 in the extended clip version. When you pack-a-punch it, you're going to get 190 damage with a 5 headshot multiplier, with 40 in the standard magazine and 50 in the extended clip magazine. And for reserve, you're getting 280 in the standard and 300 in the extended clip. Now the 74U is a wall weapon, which gives it bonus points, and on the higher rounds you will get kills with it eventually, but it is an SMG, so what can you really expect? Not the greatest, not the worst. Realistically, there's only one SMG that I'd use on these higher rounds, which we'll get to in a little bit. Moving on to the PDW, this gun's going to have 90 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier, with 50 in the magazine and 200 in reserve. When you pack-a-punch it, it's going to go up to 175 with 5 headshot multiplier, with 50 in the magazine and 350 in reserve. Now this gun's the ideal point weapon. On the higher rounds, it's very mediocre. It's not going to do a lot. The damage isn't that great. It does have that massive clip size though, so that's something that's going for it. But it is a wall weapon on future maps, and it is really satisfying to use. Won't do much on round 50 though. Just like the M1927 or the Tommy gun, will also not do that much. With 90 damage, with a 4 headshot multiplier, 50 in the magazine and 350 in reserve. When you pack-a-punch it, you're going to get 180 maximum damage with a 5 headshot multiplier, with 50 in the magazine and then 400 in reserve. This gun is essentially just a better PDW in terms of ammo and stats and fire rate and all that stuff. It has 5 more damage, it has a lot more ammo, so if you're ever in the debate between using the PDW or the M1927, use the Tommy gun. Moving on to the Uzi with 100 damage, a 4 headshot multiplier, 25 magazine, and then 275 in reserve. When you pack-a-punch it, this gun gets a giant damage buff. It goes to 230 damage with a 5 headshot multiplier, with 25 in the magazine and 300 in reserve. So a few things to take away from this weapon. First of all, it has the highest damage out of any weapon, which is great. And it also is a wall weapon. It's only on Mob of the Dead, but in terms of a wall weapon, it's a really good wall weapon. It has a decent amount of ammo, and this is one of the SMGs I would maybe use on the higher rounds if needs must. The only thing really holding back this gun is the fact that it's not on more maps, because it would be very useful on these other maps. Moving on to the MP40, which is exclusively in Origins, is going to do 110 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier, 32 in the magazine, and 192 in reserve. When you pack-a-punch it, you're going to get 200 damage with a 5 headshot multiplier, with 64 in the magazine and 256 in reserve. Now the MP40 is a great weapon, I love it, On Origins, it's useful because it has a good few wall locations and it's a very convenient weapon. It's just one of them guns I probably wouldn't use late game, just like a lot of these guns on this list. I'd probably opt more for an LMG or one of the assault rifles. Moving on to my favourite SMG, and it might be my guilty pleasure, but I don't care. It's the Scorpio Evo. So this thing's going to do 110 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier, with 32 in the magazine and 256 in reserve. But when you pack a punch it, the damage goes up to 210, which is alright, a 5 headshot multiplier, but the thing that really sells this weapon is its insane fire rate. With 1,250 rounds per minute, this gun is just a monster when it comes to killing mini-bosses and zombies alike. This damage might not be that high in comparison to some of these other weapons on this list, but the overall fire rate and the ammo that it has, which isn't too bad, makes it an incredibly useful weapon, in my opinion. Then moving on to the assault rifles, we have the FAL with 160 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier, with 20 in the magazine and 180 in reserve. Ain't gonna do much, it's an alright weapon on lower rounds, but like anything it falls off relatively quickly, more in like the early 20s. And when you go to the pack-a-punch version of the FAL, you're going to get 240 damage with a 5 headshot multiplier, with 30 in the magazine and 360 in reserve. This gun's very fine, it's not the greatest, it's not the worst, it's going to do okay damage on the higher rounds. Comparing it to some of the other guns in this game, 240 in terms of, damage is quite high, but it's kind of hindered by its slower fire rate, and it's not the most practical weapon. It is a 3-round burst when you pack-a-punch it compared to the semi-automatic. It's okay, wouldn't be my gun of choice in the higher rounds, but it's definitely better than the SMR. The SMR has 80 damage maximum with a 3 headshot multiplier, with 20 in the magazine and 140 in reserve. This gun's just very bad in general, we're not going to sugarcoat it. Moving on to the pack-punch version, 120 damage, which is very, very weak for an assault rifle, with a 4 headshot multiplier, with 30 in the magazine and 420 in reserve. The only good thing about this gun is that it has that much ammo in it. It's constantly memed on. It's probably one of the worst weapons in zombies. It doesn't really have much going for it. It wishes it could be the MTAR. Speaking of the MTAR has 140 damage with a 4 headshot multiplier with 30 in the magazine and 240 in reserve. It is very much your standard assault rifle, but that's all it needs to be. When you pack-a-punch it, it's going to have 195 damage with a 5 headshot multiplier with 30 in the magazine and 360 in reserve. This thing also has a grenade launcher if you pack-punch it enough. It's pretty cool. It's alright on the higher rounds. It's not going to be amazing long-term. It's like very similar to the other assault rifles where they'll get you a good few kills and then that's it. One thing's for sure, the MTAR's ammo is a lot better than the Type 25, which has 110 damage, a 4 headshot multiplier, 30 in the magazine and 150 in reserve. When you pack-a-punch it, the damage is going to go to 160, with a 5 headshot multiplier, with 30 in the magazine and 270 in reserve. Again, just your other basic assault rifle. I wouldn't really recommend taking it on the higher rounds. It's fine. You might as well use it if you have it, but long term, it's not that great of a weapon. And it will get you a few kills in the higher rounds, but that's just about it. At least the fire rate's okay, which is something we can't really say about the M8A1, which has 100 base damage with a 4 headshot multiplier, with 32 in the magazine and 192 in reserve. When you pack-a-punch it, it's going to go up to 150, and it's going to have a 5 headshot multiplier with 42 in the magazine and 336 in reserve. It is a 4-round burst weapon. Don't get me wrong, this isn't going to hinder the gun completely. In terms of damage, it actually isn't that high compared to some of the other weapons you think it would be, considering it's a burst weapon, but sadly it's not. If only it was a wall weapon like the M16, it might actually be viable. Speaking of the M16, the base damage has 100 with a 4 headshot multiplier. It's a 3-round burst weapon. It has 30 in the magazine and 120 in reserve. When you pack-a-punch it, it's going to have 150 damage with a 5 headshot multiplier with 30 in the magazine and 270 in reserve. We've seen the M16 before on Black Ops 1. It's fine as a weapon. It goes fully automatic when you pack-a-punch it, and that's pretty cool. The damage isn't incredible on this thing, but it's definitely a practical weapon. Speaking of a weapon that's not practical, the M14. The M14 has 105 damage, a 3 headshot multiplier, 8 in the magazine, and 96 in reserve. When you pack-a-punch it, the damage is actually going to be pretty good. It has 200 damage with a 6 headshot multiplier, with 16 in the magazine and 192 in reserve. So this gun biggest hindrance is that it's semi-automatic. The fire rate obviously isn't super fast on it, and that's why guns like the M16 will technically outrank it in terms of damage output. But in terms of the M14 and Olympia dispute, I'm M14 all day. It's a better wall weapon to use, and overall it's just a better weapon. One gun that's vastly superior to the M14 foe would be the Galil, with 150 base damage, a 4 headshot multiplier, 35 in the magazine, and 315 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, you're going to have 220 damage, a 5 headshot multiplier, 35 in the magazine, and 490 in reserve. The Galil still stands as one of the strongest assault rifles. It's a really good weapon, and yeah, overall it's just a good gun to use. This is definitely a gun I would use on the higher rounds. It has the damage, it has the fire rate, it has the ammo most importantly, and I'm so happy they brought it back from Black Ops 1 into Black Ops 2. Moving on to one of my favorite weapons in terms of design, the M27. It's a shame it's only on Nuketown, but when you are on Nuketown, it is a pretty viable weapon. When you're looking at the damage output, you have 150, you have a 4 headshot multiplier, you have 30 in the magazine, and then 240 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, the damage is going to go up to 220, with a 5 headshot multiplier, with 30 in the magazine and 360 in reserve. Now stat wise, this thing's very similar to the Galil. It just lacks a good chunk of the ammo the Galil has. But if you pick it up, I would use it. It's one of my personal favorite weapons. It feels good, it looks good, it sounds good, but it just kind of lacks out on that ammo department somewhat. Which you can't say about the AN94. This gun has 170 damage, a 4 headshot multiplier, 30 in the magazine, and 300 in reserve. Now when you're looking at the pack punch version, the damage is going to go up to 200 with a 5 headshot multiplier, with 50 in the magazine, and a whopping 600 in reserve. Now this gun is just an overall beast, and it's probably the best wall weapon in Black Ops 2. That's right, wall weapon. All the maps it's featured in, which are Die, Rise, and Buried, it is a wall weapon, and it's in pretty convenient locations as well on Die, Rise, and on Buried you can put it wherever you want with the chalk drawings. Overall, don't know why they decided to put this wall on the gun. It's a really good gun. You'd think it'd just be a mystery box weapon, but no, you can get it off the wall, and it is an absolute beast. Just like you would be if you'd hit that subscribe button. Talking about another beast of a weapon, the AK-47. Now this gun's only exclusively on Mob of the Dead unfortunately, but whilst it's there, it is definitely a gun I would recommend using if you pick it up out of the box. With 150 base damage, with a 4 headshot multiplier, with 30 in the magazine and 240 in reserve, it's an alright weapon. When you pack a punch it, the damage goes a bit insane with 250, with a 5 headshot multiplier, with 30 in the magazine and 270 in reserve. Now, practicality, this gun long term, you know, it lacks a bit of ammo and such, and it's not that great compared to other guns. But whilst you're a Mob of the Dead, it's good to use. It's going to be really effective against Brutus because of that high damage. And it is somewhat of a viable weapon on the higher rounds. Just kind of like how the STG-44 is. With 120 maximum damage, with a 4 headshot multiplier, 30 in the magazine and 210 in reserve, the base weapon's okay, but when you pack a punch it gets a whopping 200 damage with a 5 headshot multiplier, with 60 in the magazine and 330 in reserve. The reason why you want to use this gun, it's a wall weapon, the damage is okay, and the ammo ain't half bad. Yeah, there's better guns, like the Scar H, but the STG is still a very good weapon. Speak of the Scar H, this gun's insane. So, the base damage is 210, which is more than the STG. The headshot multiplier is 3.5, and has 30 in the magazine and 270 in reserve. Now, when you pack punch this gun, it's going to get 300 damage, a 4 headshot multiplier, 40 in the magazine and 440 in reserve. In all aspects, this gun's just great. Damage really good, the actual ammo is really good. In general, the gun is a really good assault rifle, and you'd be an idiot not to use it if you picked it up. Moving on to the LMGs, we have the Hammer. Now this gun's going to do a maximum of 190 damage, with a 3 headshot multiplier, 125 in the magazine, and 375 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, the damage is going to go up to 250. You're going to get a 3 headshot multiplier still, with the same magazine size of 125, and 625 in reserve. Now the Hammer is a beast of a weapon. It used to be a lot better. The recoil on it right now is, you know, not that great. But back in the day, it was a lot more controlled. The damage is good, fire rate is good, ammo is pretty good as well. In terms of damage, it actually shares the same damage marks as a lot of the other LMGs in the game. But we'll move on to that, but it is an overall pretty beast weapon. Moving on to the RPD, this gun's going to have 140 damage with a 3 headshot multiplier, 100 in the magazine and 400 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, the damage is going to go up to 180 with a 3 headshot multiplier with 125 in the magazine and 750 in reserve. In terms of the actual damage department, this gun isn't that great, but in terms of ammo, it does pretty good. You have 100 more shots in this than you do with the hammer. On higher rounds, it's going to be okay, but there's other LMGs I'd rather go for. I would rather go for the hammer or the LSAT. Speaking of the LSAT does 190 damage with a free headshot multiplier, with 100 in the magazine and 400 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, it's going to go up to 250 damage with that free headshot multiplier, 100 in the magazine and 600 in reserve. Now in terms of LMGs, this gun's a pretty good one. I overall like the aesthetic appeal, the damage is pretty good, the ammo is pretty decent, and you can also get it buried on that infamous spot on the wall where you do the parkour, you can pick it up early on. So yeah, there's some convenience to the weapon as well. Moving on to my favorite LMG in this game, it has to be the MG08. The base version of this gun is going to do 200 damage maximum with a free headshot multiplier, 100 in the magazine and 400 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, it's going to go up to 250 with a free headshot multiplier, 100 in the magazine still, but then 600 in reserve. This gun actually has a special ability compared to some of the other weapons. The bullets can ricochet off enemies to collide with other enemies, meaning that in terms of hordes, you can do a lot of damage. This gun is only on Origins, but I always make an effort to try and pick it up for first of all nostalgia and the practical weapon use of it. It's a pretty decent weapon, and when you're playing Origins, you just have to pick it up. Moving on to our snipers, we have the DSR-50, which will do 800 damage maximum with a 10 headshot multiplier, with 4 in the magazine and 48 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, you're going to get 1000 damage with that 10 headshot multiplier, 8 in the magazine and 96 in reserve. Now in terms of damage, this gun's really good. Alongside with double tap, this thing can sort of kill on the higher rounds really easily. It's a very static weapon. Obviously it's a bolt action, so it's not going to be the most fast at killing. But in terms of damage, in terms of ammo, overall the weapon is just very, very good. And you can get iron sights on it if you pack punch it a few times and you get the iron sights. So hey, I mean, even if you don't want to use the normal scope, you have the iron sights you can use. Moving on to the Barrett, that has a maximum of 600 damage, a 10 headshot multiplier, 5 in the magazine and then 30 in reserve. Pack punching it, you'll get that 900 damage with a 10 headshot multiplier, with 7 in the magazine and 42 in reserve. This weapon's biggest downfall is the fact that it doesn't have a lot of ammo. The damage is actually pretty good on it, and stat wise is pretty much identical to the SVU. Speaking of the SVU, this gun has 550 damage with a 10 headshot multiplier, with 12 in the magazine and 96 in reserve. And when you pack punch it, you're going to get 900 damage with a 10 headshot multiplier, with 12 in the magazine and 192 in reserve. This gun's also a wall weapon. It's so overpowered, and the fact it's a wall weapon makes it very viable on the higher rounds as well. It's going to do insane damage, and say what you want about Jimmy Zielinski, but his wall weapon choices for the future, like for the free maps he did in Black Ops 2, they were pretty fucking insane. They're pretty good. Moving on to the Ballista, this gun's only on Origins with 150 damage, a 4 headshot multiplier, 8 in the magazine, and 64 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, the damage is going to go up to 400 maximum with a 10 headshot multiplier, with 10 in the magazine and 120 in reserve. This gun isn't that great, it is a wall weapon, it's exclusively on Origins, and I mean, it's kind of viable in the lower rounds, but I wouldn't take it anywhere past round 30. Moving on to our shotguns, we have the Olympia with 150 damage for each pellet that hits, and there's 4 pellets. This gun's able to hold up 2 shells at a time with 38 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, it's going to have 600 damage for each pellet that hits, and again it's 4 pellets. With the gun being able to hold 2 shells with 60 in reserve, this gun does do a decent amount of damage. On the higher rounds, I mean, it's not going to do insane. I wouldn't take it with me. It is a starting room wall weapon after all. But the gun is, you know, really hated towards, and the people over at the M14 gang, they kind of need to rate it in a wee bit because it is a good gun. Moving on to the Remington, this gun can do 310 maximum damage for every pellet that hits, again with their 4, with 6 shells and then 48 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, it's going to be 600 times 4 for the pellets, and then you have 10 shells that it can hold with 70 in reserve. Now, I always thought this gun was a lot better than it probably actually is. I think it's somewhat useful because it's a wall gun, obviously, and it's good on the lower rounds, and on the higher rounds, you will get kills with it. It'll just take a little while. There is definitely better shotguns to take with you, though. For example, the M1216. This gun's going to do 280 maximum damage for each pellet that hits, again with 4 being able to hit, with 16 shells that it can hold, with 48 in reserve. When you pack a punch it, you're going to get 975 damage for every pellet that hits, times 4 once again, with 24 shells it's being able to hold, with 72 in reserve. This gun overall is a beast. I love this gun. When you look at the actual damage, it does a lot more than the Remington and then the Olympia as well. It has a pretty fast fire rate alongside that. Sure, it's a box weapon, but overall, it's one of my favorite shotguns in Black Ops 2. Moving on to the S12, this gun's going to do 270 damage with being able to hold 10 shells with 30 in reserve. When you pack-a-punch it, when pack-a-punching it is going to go up to 560 damage for every pellet that hits, which is 4. And then you're going to have 10 shells that you can load into the gun with 50 in reserve. And you can also get fast mags on this gun as well. In terms of the box weapon exclusive shotguns, I would say that this is probably not the best, but it's still decent. I would say that the M1216 is a better shotgun overall though. Now moving on to my guilty pleasure, the KSG with 800 damage, with 14 shells that the gun can hold, with 56 in reserve. When you pack-a-punch it, it's going to be able to do up to 1000 damage, with 28 shells it can hold, with 84 in reserve. When reloading this gun, it can reload 2 shells at a time. The damage is insane on it. Moving on to the RPG, this gun's going to do 600 direct impact damage. With 1 rocket you can load in with 20 in reserve. When you pack-a-punch it, you're going to get 1200 damage on it. It can hold up to 8 rockets that it can shoot with 40 in reserve. The gun damage is pretty good. I mean, it's not a bad weapon to have. The only thing that's lacking is PhD in this game, where you can only really get it on Buried and Origins. So if you're going to use this, I'd only really use it on them maps. But in terms of damage, it's pretty good. It's a fun weapon. And overall, it is still a pretty big hell of a beast. The War Machine, on the other hand, is pretty mediocre. It does 200 direct impact damage with 450 explosive damage, with 6 grenades that it can hold up to with 18 in reserve. When you pack-a-punch it, the damage is going to go up to 600 for direct impact, with 900 explosive damage, with 6 grenades it can hold up once again, with 48 in reserve. The damage on this thing just isn't that great. I mean, it's alright, I guess. When you pack-a-punch it, it explodes on impact, which is kind of cool. But not something you want to be taking on the higher rounds. Just like the ballistic knife, this gun's going to do 500 melee damage, or if you shoot, and 1000 if you have the Bowie knife with it. It has 1 like knife thing in the magazine, I guess, and 4 in the reserve. When you pack-a-punch it, it's going to do 1000 melee or shoot damage, with 1 in the magazine and 9 in reserve. Overall, this gun's good for mobility and reviving your friends, but I wouldn't use it on high rounds to kill zombies. Moving on to the Death Machine. This gun's actually pretty good. I like it. It's going to do 220 damage with 150 in the magazine and 300 in reserve. When you pack-a-punch it, it's going to do 350 damage with 550 in the magazine and 550 in reserve. I like this weapon for its aesthetics, and it will get kills in the high rounds, but the mobility and the kind of lack of damage as well, it just makes it not a really good weapon to use. And to be honest, you'd be better off using something like the LSAT that actually has a bit of significant damage behind it. Moving on to the ray gun, it does 20 in the magazine and 160 in reserve. When you pack-a-punch it, 2000 splash damage with 40 in the magazine and 200 in reserve. This is going to be one of the better guns on the higher rounds just because it has a pretty high amount of damage it can do. And with the ray gun Mark II, this gun's going to do 2300 damage with 21 in the magazine and then 162 in reserve. When you pack-a-punch it, the damage is going to double and going up to 4600 with 100,000 headshot multiplier, with 42 in the magazine and 201 in reserve. This gun's by hands down the best gun to use on the higher rounds because of the insane damage it does. I know we weren't really classing wonder weapons, but with the ray gun and ray gun Mark II, since it's on all the maps in Black Ops 2 and you can have it with the main wonder weapon, I thought we'd just include it in the main weapon pool anyway. Anyway, if you like this video, you might like this video here, where I go over all the Black Ops 1 guns. Remember to subscribe for more, and I'll see ya.